Risk Revisited. This video is a talk on risk in technology that I gave for the University of Hull in late November 2020. It's an extension of a previous video which is available on YouTube. I apologize for the inevitable overlaps, however, there is much new material. Today I'm going to focus on how risk is implicit in technology, all technology, and no one is immune, from the novice user to the most knowledgeable professional. Indeed, the most sophisticated users are at greater risk because they tend to be overconfident about the technology and just don't see the problems coming. Remember, Noah was an amateur. The Titanic was built by professionals. So, what exactly is risk? Let me start by going right back to basics to consider how we humans perceive and conceive of the world around us. First, I will analyze the relationships between human cognition, observation, and memory. And please note that by the word observation, I include all sensory input that is linked to cognition, not just sight. Consider cognition, the way we make sense of the world. Cognition is the ability of the brain to construct schemas, what we can call pattern making. Then observation. In order to observe any complex collection of elements in our environment, the brain will use these cognitive schemas, which are deeply embedded in our thoughts, although they're unapproachable by thought. These schemas are mapped onto the elements being observed. This we can call pattern matching. In this way, human cognition will structure and simplify how those elements are represented in our thoughts. These representations are used to formulate descriptions of what we have observed as a precursor to initiating a response. Meanwhile, it's all continuously stored in memory for future reference, to be used as and when required for further cognition, observation, and action. Of course, I mustn't forget the fact that the human body may react automatically to physical stimuli when with pre-programmed responses. For example, skin blistering when it's burned. However, at this time, I'm not interested in such automatic responses. From now on, I will focus only on the cognitive. Cognitive patterns have a unique function. They help our brains draw distinctions in respect of the observed world around us. We can then categorize the objects we have observed and thereby describe them with these schemas, these patterns, and use that description to decide how to react to the world, hopefully to our advantage. We humans benefit by our cognition, sampling, arranging, simplifying, supposing, and schematizing with patterns, thereby interpreting what is observed by our senses in a way appropriate for surviving and prospering. Patterns created by cognition need not remain inside our heads. We humans can externalize the regularities in our patterns, in speech, in writing, and images, so we can communicate them to others. But even more amazing, we can also make them physical, tangible, as artifacts in the world, in particular as technologies. These artifacts serve to reinforce cognition's descriptive interpretation of the world by becoming part of our patterns of observation, further helping us to deny the complexity that surrounds us. What is observed is not the thing itself, but an internalized representation of that thing, which has to fit into categories constructed for it by observation, by cognition and memory. Patterns represent the world to our cognition by manipulating structures and categories among our patterns. The brain assumes that this will affect both the world and the artifacts we place in it in an equivalent way, and that consistencies and regularities in our cognition will carry over onto the observed terrain. This seems to work as empirically we sense objects in the world behaving more or less as expected, most of the time. Unfiltered, the perceived world around us is confusing. However, order coalesces around the patterns we place in the world, thereby seeming to make the observed world tidier and less hazardous, one that can be tamed by constructing and imposing patterns, both the nebulous cerebral kind and the physical. These form a pragmatic sink for the noise surrounding all our senses, giving us a springboard for opportunistic action, thereby pulling out the reality, albeit mixed up with uncertainty. I use the term uncertainty here to describe any situation when what is observed appears to us with a strangeness that arises from an unexpected and surprising conspiracy of events. Thus, cognition makes the world seem tidier by placing structures in it, and in doing so, it all makes sense to us. That our experience of the world is merely the imposition of patterns doesn't really matter, because the patterns impart the ability to act by creating options, directions, consistency of behavior, predictability, and repeatability. In doing so, it is the means whereby we humans adapt to our ever-changing surroundings. By limiting the flow of sense data, the agglomeration of patterns will filter out any overload and enable our thoughts to crystallize on a course of action. And note the plural is used here, patterns. No single pattern can be a complete description. Each pattern is linear, simplified, and partial. And our need to make decisions will delimit what sense data is included and what is excluded. And by partial, I mean both biased and incomplete. Here, the word linear means the categorization on which cause and effect, the processes of cause and effect, are insinuated into observation, where any action ends with an expected reaction. All observation, the patterns matched, and the subsequent cognition is the result of linearity imposed on what is, after all, a non-linear world. That having been said, there is no cause and effect in the world. Causality and linearity are fundamental to pattern making, as indeed is anything loosely termed as instinct. But the world around us is chaotic and non-linear. It is as it is. Whatever that may or may not be, we humans simply stumble around, thankfully with the capacity to project a linear causal order onto it, with cognition, observation, and memory. The world does not operate because of anything. Causality and indeed linearity is all in our heads. We shouldn't be surprised at the prominence of the question why in human thinking, because causality and linearity are building blocks of such thought. But there can be no meaning in why, only in how. Patterns do not give explanations, only descriptions. Cognition fishes out regularities in what is observed, but with numerous interpretations at various levels of sophistication, although they're all restricted by linear thinking. Causality is a blunt instrument that convinces us of the validity of our interpretive descriptions, of what is necessarily so in the world. This is hardly surprising, since causality is the self-reinforcing argumentation we use to convince ourselves. Causality, be it in mathematical or any other form, is merely a means of description and the basis of questioning, but one that itself cannot be questioned. We humans must develop numerous linear causal patterns corresponding to different conditions, each limited from its very inception by the appropriateness of its application in various conditions and situations. Subsequently, we may both reflect on and thereby deal with any particular situation in the best possible way. Of course, that's a subjective decision, of course. Then, if required, we can communicate those reflections to others. But I must make it clear here, there is no ultimate sense in our bizarre world. As individuals and in groups, we must make sense of the world by categorizing it with all-encompassing patterns that have been synthesized from previously potent remembered patterns, which have come down to us as individuals and in groups. So, what makes sense to us? Well, any situation where what we make of the input from our senses conforms to preconceived notions. A collection of these patterns will have been individually built up by each of us in becoming what we are, what we have become. Through early childhood, we gradually come to believe that these patterns tell us the truth about things, the meaning of things, that the world is as it appears to us via our patterns. It is reality. We can do nothing about the amazing way that pattern making and matching are built into the physical functioning of being human. We must just be grateful that patterns, both private and shared, the shared ones are the externalized ideas, culture, etc., are there for the taking, for the making, and for the matching. These patterns, the products of the past, are the ways in which we deal with so-called reality, in becoming what each of us is individually. Now, in this description of the brain's creation of patterns as a proxy for the world, I am not saying that there is no real universal out there. However, I do assert that any universal, if there is one, is an unknown and unknowable terrain. We humans can never understand what true reality is because we are limited by the reach of our senses, by our representation of such a reality, and ultimately by memory and our observation and cognition of that reality. This reality has developed so that rational questions can be asked about our situation, and from that, sensible decisions may be made. However, each reality is subtly different for each individual. But with most humans, their set of patterns is close enough to those of others. Hence, we may assume that we can share and so agree with on what is happening around us. However, the belief that we are sharing ideas, a common worldview, a shared reality, is a delusion. These patterns are not identical. They are similar, yes, but they're not the same. But please don't ask me to say exactly what I mean by a pattern. For to do this, I would need the recursive use of patterns themselves. Hence, the notion of pattern is necessarily unobservable and uncertain. It's non-linear, it's indescribable. Nevertheless, I can't define an elephant, but I know one when I see one. Using patterns in the way described, we humans can deal with our situation. The world around us is then transformed into what is sensed, what is noticed. But also much is unsensed and unnoticed. The unnoticed, which includes all things nonlinear, is ignored completely by cognition, which is not necessarily a good thing as it hides potential dangers. But not noticing things is essential, for otherwise our senses would be swamped. The unconscious act of ignoring simplifies and unfreezes our thoughts. Examples include sounds of frequency below 20 Hz and above 20 kHz, or seeing objects smaller than 0.1 of a millimeter. What remains noticed may then be considered as a combination of the ordinary and the extraordinary. The ordinary is treated as being commonplace, unexceptional, unsurprising, predictable, within the schema of patterns. it seems to behave exactly as expected. The individual's response to the ordinary, although being aware of it, is spontaneous, automatic, and confidently almost sleepwalking through it, the normal state of being in the world. This leaves us free to concentrate on the strange and the extraordinary, on uncertainty. The extraordinary has the capacity to confound the observer, who, limited by pattern making and matching, must still match it against patterns. Since previous patterns don't fit, new patterns must be created by variations and combinations of the old in an attempt to map onto the extraordinary and then see what happens. In other words, treat the extraordinary as risk, a heady mix of hazard and opportunity. This is the key to dealing with uncertainty. Using these two noticed elements, the ordinary and the extraordinary, and ignoring the unnoticed, humans can model the observed world, necessarily in a causal and linear manner, and swap the hopelessness for the optimism in a plan of action. However, cognition can never be totally confident of its modelling of the extraordinary. By successfully confronting similar extraordinary situations many times over and treating them as if they are similar to something familiar, these too will eventually appear to be tamed, to become ordinary. And thus, as individuals, we are convinced by an apparently predictable reality, namely the totality of what we have come to notice and model with patterns over each lifetime. This is shared dynamically with those around us in a cultural reality, which naturally feeds back as a major part of a person's individual reality. Through excessive use, parts of the ordinary may subsequently become almost totally ignored, but I stress, this is not being unnoticed. From this perspective, risk is not some objective thing out there. Rather, what is extraordinary in our observations is a failure of our present state of pattern making to perceive what is being observed as ordinary. Risk, then, is the subjective need to develop new patterns, which of course leads to further choices and new uncertainties. Thus, risks lead on to options from which we choose how to make our way in the world as we sense it, taking advantage of those opportunities while hopefully minimizing the dangers. That being said, we are still at the mercy of what is unnoticed and what is ignored. So risk is an output. It's a necessity to develop new patterns and to choose between them in the face of uncertainty. And we continue on and on. We project patterns, cerebral and physical, onto the uncertainty of our environment, thereby sampling it, separating the noticed from the unnoticed. Data on what is noticed then feeds back to help us manage the perceived risk in observation, alongside what is considered mundane. The remainder, in fact, most of what is in the world, stays unsensed. This is just as well, or as already noted, our senses would be swamped. Unfortunately, the patterns we introduce are a pale shadow of what they represent, and the differences between the map and the terrain will generate new uncertainties, for which we must generate new patterns, and thus new risks and new data, ad infinitum, ad nauseum. Each different choice of schema that we decide to impose on uncertainty will itself lead to new, different forms of risk. But as humans, we have no choice other than to make such assumptions about our world and to impose rules and guidelines and procedures, a priori synthetic judgments, patterns all, using linear causal cognitive models that interpret our observations. So much for the basics. Finally, we are in a position to discuss technology and risk. We have seen how patterns are not just cognitive. We can make them physical, solid, tangible as artifacts. A chair, a hammer, a nail, a computer. And these come with their own risks. A hammer may have been invented to knock in nails, but it was soon used to hit another human over the head. Now, we place these stable patterns in the world where we believe they stay predictable, exactly as we made them, reinforcing our previous interpretations of the world. Order coalesces around these physical artifacts, thereby seeming to make the world tidier and less hazardous. But does it? The environment will interact with the artifacts placed in it. The artifacts themselves will sense that interaction, either passively or actively. Passive sensing is when the artifact can do nothing about the action of the environment, other than to behave in a predetermined way. Examples are how ferrous objects rust in the presence of water, or projectiles follow parabolic trajectories. However, there are situations where technological artifacts are active and reactive. For example, motion-sensitive security lighting, and of course, computers. In particular, artificial intelligence. By active, we mean the technology will project patterns onto its environment and then respond to the feedback it receives. In other words, an active technology in its sensing of and interacting with its environment can be said to be observing that environment prior to choosing a mode of action. In doing so, the technology will have split its environment into the noticed and unnoticed parts. Subsequently, what is noticed can be further divided into the ordinary and the extraordinary. The usual intention is for a technology to be applied in limited, preconceived, almost laboratory conditions. In other words, it is assumed that the technology will observe only an ordinary environment. But there's a whole uncertain world out there, and even the most mundane technology will occasionally confront the extraordinary, as with car crashes, for example, or power failures. In this application, a technology may notice elements that are originally unnoticed by human observers, and vice versa. For example, a simple microscope, which on the one hand presents images of microbes invisible to the human eye, but which on the other can't hear a human voice. The microscope is, in fact, a very good example of a technology that takes what is normally unnoticed in human observation and transforms it into a form that is noticeable to humans. Anything strange in the transformed data will introduce previously unknown forms of uncertainty and risk, and thus new opportunities and dangers. For example, the microscope fundamentally changed theories of disease. But the active in technology isn't just restricted to observation. With computer technology, we are not stretching the imagination too much if we describe programming as a form of cognition. Of course, until the advent of artificial intelligence, basically a form of data-driven programming, computers could only deal with what was ordinary in their environment, treating everything in an expected, programmed way. Here, expected is used in the sense that the computer matched patterns that were programmed into the software. Anything extraordinary that was not intercepted by a human observer would necessarily either fail or be misinterpreted as and treated similar to something that was ordinary. Thus, it would become a risk to the technology, and that risk could be transferred to human observers. Conversely, observations that are ordinary, risk-free to the technology may be problematic to human observers. One such source of risk is that priorities programmed in the computer may be different from a human's. Dylan Osborne from Buckinghamshire joined Facebook. Recently divorced, he was looking to kickstart his social life. As usual, the site sent out a friend request to everyone in Dylan's email address book. Unfortunately, it included his ex-wife, who had previously taken out a court injunction banning him from contacting her. Although the message was sent without Dylan's knowledge, he did spend 3 days in jail. Computers are everywhere, and so the technology itself is no longer considered extraordinary by human cognition. And in becoming ordinary, it is not seen as a risk. In giving computers authority for decision making, those decisions are no longer questioned. However, in itself, technology cannot take on any responsibility for its application. Guns don't kill people. People with guns kill people. Therefore, blame for any failure of the technology will land on some unsuspecting humans. Computers can now remember the totality of their actions and decisions and can feed this information back into its decision making, data-driven programming, and its subsequent actions. This can only reinforce the suspicion that computers are exhibiting a form of cognition and observation. Hence, we can infer that each computer will have derived its own individual reality. Network them together and we get a shared computer reality. Any differences between computer and human realities will have opened up a whole new can of worms. In August 1987, there was a collision between two RAF Tornado fighters on separate low-flying night exercises over Cumbria. They were based in different airfields, but the planes were given the same computer program on their onboard computers. A cassette given to each navigator before takeoff flew each plane automatically to avoid obstacles like hills and electricity pylons. Although coming from different directions, on one occasion, two planes arrived at exactly the same spot simultaneously, hence the crash. What no one had realized was that the reality of the technology was not three-dimensional like a pilot's reality, but a single linear path from that specific starting point. Humanity has now reached the point where artificial intelligence has been given free rein to deal with the extraordinary, both in our world, but more worryingly, with the extraordinary in its own, and of which we humans can have little or no idea. With yesterday's software, at least the patterns used to create the reality of cognition and observation would make sense to us humans. A human will have explicitly programmed them into the software. However, with the latest computer technology, like neural networks, it's often impossible to externalize the patterns being used by the computer as it develops its own reality, and that we humans can never understand. With little or no oversight of computerized decisions, the mismatch between human and computer realities will inevitably open up a whole new world of grief.